I have another honor of presenting you with our second keynote speaker, Dr. Michael Giangreco. And I have known of Dr. Giangreco for a really long time. He's got a remarkable history, and he's done an incredible job of advocating and supporting and researching for the best interests of individuals with autism and other disabilities and their families. And he's a leader in the field. We all, us lowly people, look up to him with great admiration and jealousy. So Michael, Dr. Giangreco is a professor at the University of Vermont in the College of Education and Social Sciences. Prior to joining the faculty in 1988, he spent 13 years serving a variety of capacities as a community residence counselor with adults with disabilities, a special ed teacher, a special ed administrator, and more. His work focuses on various aspects of education for students with disabilities within general education, such as curriculum planning and adaptation, related services, decision-making and coordination, and, of course, paraprofessional issues. He is very, very well published in numerous and well-recognized and peer-reviewed contexts, books, research articles, journal articles on a variety of topics. But my favorite, I have to say, are his books of cartoons. And we use those all the time when we do our PowerPoints. They are copyrighted, and we get permission to do that. Just want to know. So, Dr. Giangreco, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Is this working? How's that? Is that working? Is that working okay? No. I'll hold it. How's that? That's better. I wonder if I could ask anybody that's near the back door if you wouldn't mind closing the doors for a moment. And I'm going to start by telling a story that actually I hadn't planned to tell, but Phil, you inspired me to tell this story because you were talking about absurdities and the theater of the absurd. So this story is a takeoff on that. It was several years ago now. I was visiting a school up in the northeast, what's called the Northeast Kingdom of Vermont, the northeast corner of Vermont, very rural area. And I was visiting a kindergarten there where there was a student with severe multiple disabilities included in the regular kindergarten. And because it was about 2.5 hours away from home, I arrived just when they were having their mid-morning snack. And the kids were all sitting at, the little tables with the little chairs, and they were having raisins and peanuts for a snack, and they were drinking milk. And I went to the table where the kind of target student that I was there to visit was seated with 4 of his classmates. And I knelt down to the table and started to try to make conversation because I was a stranger to these kids, and I was trying to put them at ease. And there was one little boy that it was really a tough sell. He was not buying that I was there. So I went into this absurdity mode, and so I said to all the kids, how's the snack? Is it good? And most of them would say, yeah, it's good. We like it. And this one boy just looked at me, wouldn't say a word. And I kept on trying to draw him out, wouldn't say a word. And then finally, I kind of looked at him directly and I said, where do you think those raisins come from? Do you think they come from a raisin tree, a raisin bush, or dried grapes? And he looked at his friends and he said, dried grapes. Oh, you're good. I said, what about those peanuts? Where do you think those peanuts come from? A peanut tree, a peanut bush, or dried grapes? And he smiled a little bit and he said, a peanut bush? Oh, can't fool this guy. Okay, I'm going to get you now. What about the milk? You think the milk came from a milk tree, a milk bush, or dried grapes? And he got a big smile on his face and he said, I know where milk comes from. Milk comes from cows. And when I grow up, I'm going to be a farmer and I'm going to have my own cows. And I said, that's great. And I looked at the little boy sitting next to him and I said, what do you think you want to be when you grow up? And he said, I want to be a psychologist. And I thought thought this was the strangest response for a 5-year-old. And it bugged me all morning. I thought, why would a 5-year-old say they want to be a psychologist? I thought, well, maybe one of his parents is a psychologist, or he heard this on television. I just couldn't get it out of my mind. So when they were going outside to recess later in the day, I went up to this little boy and I said, I need to ask you a favor. Could you please tell me, what is it that a psychologist does? And he looked at me with that indignant look, that you can only get from a 5-year-old, with the hands on the hips and like you're supposed to know this, you're a grown-up. And he looked at me and he said, they put dinosaur bones together. So all those ists and ologists, they seem to all sound the same. But absurdity is a good way to get in good with little ones. So what I'm going to share with you over the next hour is a lot of generalizations, because so I'll just say that up front. And as you can see, I've returned from the land of the banished. And Mary Beth and I are used to this, where she speaks and I'm banished, and then I get to come back. So I'm glad to be back. I think she realizes that I just actually am right outside the door the whole time. She can't see me, but I'm listening. So what I'm going to share with you are some generalizations, but they're based on research that our projects have done and that lots of other people around the country and in some cases around the world have done. And I just want to start with the slide that's up here. After several attempts, Fred begins to realize that cookbook recipes for inclusion just don't work. And it gets to the issue of individualization. I want to start with telling you a little bit about Vermont. And even since the time that I made this slide, these data have changed. And these are from the federal IDEAdata.org statistics that you can access online. Basically, Vermont includes about 78% of its students with disabilities in regular education. That number has dropped to approximately 70%. Okay? It was at one time as high as 89%, back around 1992 or so. Whether it was ever really that high, I really don't know. I mean, I think there's a lot of these numbers that are in the federal database that are reported from states are very, very fuzzy numbers. I wouldn't put a lot of stock in the truth or accuracy. They're very gross indicators. But the point is that is two things. One is that the inclusion rates have dropped a little bit, at least as they're reported, but also at the same time that Vermont remains among one of the more inclusive states in the country in terms of the percentage of kids. Historically, it's been a leader. But you see the, kind of no smoking variation here. Vermont is not an inclusion utopia. Lots of times I visit places and people, think somehow that because they've heard about Vermont, and believe me, we have the same problems, same issues as everybody else has. If you came to visit Vermont and you said, please take me to like a model inclusive program, I'd be hard pressed to take you to a school where school-wide I could say, wow, things here are fantastic. It's classroom to classroom, teacher to teacher. The kids are physically present in the classes more, but in terms of quality and what you think of as good practice, there's plenty of work to do. So I want to just start off by making sure that you have a realistic understanding that we still have a lot of work to do. And I'm hoping that some of the things I'm going to share with you, based on the little bit I know about California, which is not a lot, but I understand that there's a little bit less inclusion here than we have in Vermont, but that some of you are moving in that direction. I'm hoping that some of the things from today, that those of you who are making those movements will be able to avoid some of the mistakes that we've made. And we've made plenty of them over the last 20 years of trying to include students with disabilities. And let me just say that I'm talking generally. I realize this is an inclusion conference, an autism conference, but my own work, and Mary Beth's as well, includes students with autism, but really cuts across the whole gamut of students with disabilities, with a particular focus on students who have more moderate and severe disabilities. So students with intellectual disabilities, students with deaf blindness, as well as students with autism and other disabilities. So one of the things I want to start off with is I'm going to show you a short video. And these are images of a young woman named Erin McKenzie, who graduated from Westerville High School in Ohio in 2004. And Erin had Down syndrome. And you see the heading here, Changing Expectations and Urgency. A lot of us who are presenters at this conference have been at this work 30 or more years. And one of the things that is really, I mean, it's encouraging how far we've come as a field, but at the same time, it's really disheartening sometimes. And while we're dragging our feet as administrators, policymakers, you know, every level within the system, kids are growing up, you know, and they're missing out on amazing opportunities. I was a special class teacher in the 1970s. I worked in special schools, in homogeneously grouped classes for kids with severe disabilities, including kids with autism, and I became completely and utterly hooked on inclusive education when I saw what the possibilities were, when I saw what could happen for kids with disabilities, non-disabled kids, their families, their service providers, how it changed who they were and what the opportunities were that were available to them. So I'm hooked. And this presentation is totally biased, okay? Yes, I'm going to tell you some stuff that's based on some evidence, but you'd figure it out right away anyway. I'm biased. I'm biased towards including people with disabilities. And just because I've seen some incredible things. And so I want to show you this videotape of Erin because I think she's an example of an incredible story. Erin's family fought for her to be included from the beginning. So she was included all through school. Some years were a struggle, some years were better. But she had a full, rich school experience, the kind that that other kids don't have. I'm going to show you this, and then we're going to talk about it a little bit. But I think that she's one of my reminders about why we need urgency. And hopefully we're all set with the sound. Oops, and I'm also going to bring up a text version of her speech so that if you have any difficulty understanding her speech patterns, because she does have kind of classic speech patterns of a person with Down syndrome. Wait a minute, we have to move this. Oh, that's tricky. That's...
Did you love high school? I did. We had some very good teachers, and the best part was being with friends. In class, activities, and parties everywhere. We learned new things in high school, and we discovered what we were good at or like to do. I met that I love Shakespeare and film and choir and drama club, and working with the Algebra College with the department, and we learn about different culture and language. I learned because language. Sometimes we need help from other friends or dogs, and sometimes we need help them. It is nice to help other people. We learned that something hard for us. We had to study and practice, and we had to be on time and be organized. But we have more to learn the character, who is and one of my favorite plays, the Fantastic Scene. I want to do things I dreamed about, but not done before. Perhaps I'm fat, or wild, or mad. But I want much more than keeping health. Much more, much more, much more. Go sinner, enjoy your life.
2 months after Erin gave that speech to several hundred people at graduation, she died. She died of natural causes, but like a lot of kids that we work with, you know, most people in this room have known way too many kids that have died young. Her parents, although obviously devastated by that loss, felt really positive that they hadn't waited, you know, that they made sure that she had a full, inclusive life when she was alive. So there were no regrets about the time that she had with us. What was there's so many parts about this video that that speak to me. One is I don't want to suggest that she just sat down and wrote this. She did compose the ideas, and she sat with her mom over a period of time, and they wrote this out together. These were her thoughts. But she composed it in terms of the thought process. I think you could tell she was reading it. When I was a special education teacher, kids with the presumed level of intellectual ability or disability as Erin, nobody was teaching them to read and decode words. Maybe we were doing a little bit with sight words, men and women on the bathroom, stuff like that, exit. But nobody was doing the kind of literacy work back then that they're doing now. If you said, kid with Down syndrome, or kid with more kind of, let's say, classic autism, let's teach them Shakespeare. People would look at you like you were crazy, okay? But this kid knew more about Shakespeare certainly than I do, and she loved it. It was the thing that really kind of made her heart sing, and you don't know what those things are until you try and expose kids to lots of different regular ed curriculum areas. And did you notice the hair flip? Did you notice that? There are at least a few people in this audience that are old enough to remember the kind of classic Down syndrome haircut, which was kind of the bowl cut. Remember the bowl cut? All the kids with Down syndrome had the same haircut. But all of her girlfriends, they all had long hair. Where do you learn that? You noticed a little wave to Dad who was taking the video? So, to me, Erin's an inspiration about what's possible, and to not put artificial expectations on people. I think that's one of the things about inclusive education that's so foundational, is to not allow labels like Down syndrome or autism or different forms of on the autism spectrum to limit how we think about people. I teach a graduate class at the University of Vermont in the area of severe disabilities, and it's a required course for the graduate students in special education, and it's open to upper division undergraduate students who are minoring in special education. And this year I had 4 undergraduates in my class this past spring. They were from all different fields. Some of them not in social services or social sciences. One of them was a student who was majoring in English but was minoring in special education. And this young man had autism. And I've asked him whether I could share a little bit about his story. So he was a college student, matriculated college student, and he presented in a manner that I think, I'm not sure if it's the right lingo today, but what we think of as kind of classic autism. He's somebody that 30 years ago people would have labeled as having autism. And so it was a great experience both for me as an instructor and for my students to see that his competency and to not put limits on him. And I think that's part of the message of inclusive education and this idea of urgency, that we need to really get moving because it's taken us way too long. One of the questions always comes up, are some students too disabled to be included? I mean, so no matter what you do, you go someplace and they say, well, let me show you this kid, okay? I can tell you that for every kind of kid that you can identify, who you'd say, well, here's one, this kid's too disabled to be included, right? You can find a kid with very similar or virtually identical characteristics who is included. So it's not about the characteristics of the student. We can include successfully any kids we choose to include. It's not about whether they're too disabled or what their label is. It's about us. It's about what we do, how we create the environments, what we do with instruction, what our attitudes are. It's us. It's on us. Okay? Because, like I said, for every kid that's excluded who has a certain type of disability, you can find kids that are included who have that same type and level of disability. So I think it's an unhelpful question, and inclusion itself is really a matter of social policy. The research is important, but the research gives us the information about what works and how to do things, not whether to do them. Whether or not it's a good idea to include people with disabilities in the regular lives in the community, in schools, at home, and so on, isn't a research question. That's a matter of values and social policy. The research tells us what works. And as I mentioned, for everyone that's segregated, there's one that's included. So it's about us. And progress is going to continue to be delayed when we continue to take this kind of either-or approach. One of the things that people are always saying is, well, if we want to teach them, reading, then we have to pull out, special class and really do reading. And basically the message is you can do one or the other. You can either include them or you can give them good instruction. Well, if we do one or the other, we are never going to make progress in our field. The only way we're going to make progress in our field is to say we want it all. We want good quality instruction on meaningful curriculum in inclusive environments, and to push ourselves to, what's it going to take to do that? So it can't be an either or. And there are people out there, well-respected people who will remain nameless, who would encourage you to believe that you have to choose. You can either do a good job with instruction and curriculum, or you can include them, but you can't do both. And I can tell you that the only places I've ever seen that I think are doing really quality inclusion do both. Because you can't be socially included if you're not part of the life of the classroom. You have to be part of the life of the classroom. That means being part of the same activities. So which definition of inclusion are we talking about? We're trying to decide this is a parent talking to the principal, we're trying to decide which school district is best for our daughters. We want to know what you have. Inclusion, inclusive education, or full inclusion? Oh, I get it, it's a trick question. Mr. Moody continues to be befuddled by lack of clear definitions. We don't have the term inclusion is not an IDEA. We don't have an agreed upon definition really in the field. There are several out there. Some of them have overlapping characteristics, but we don't have one agreed upon definition. I'm going to give you a definition, and I'm going to ask you to think about the extent to which these characteristics occur in your schools. But one of the things I want to say before that is just to watch out for practices that are mislabeled as inclusive, that are partially implemented or low-quality practices. Everybody in this room can probably tell you about a story of, oh, let me tell you about this kid I saw. This kid is included. He's dumped in the back of the classroom, the curriculum hasn't been modified, the paraprofessionals on him like Velcro, he's pulled out for therapies, and they'll go on and tell you about a whole bunch of bad practices. And I would say to people, that's not inclusive education. So, if you're doing something and it's, you want to be careful about when people mislabel it so that you're in a position to say, well, that's not what inclusive education means. Because if inclusive education means dumping kids in regular ed classrooms and not supporting them, Mary Beth and I are not in favor of that. We're not about that. So, we define it differently, and most people do. But you'll hear a lot of people that'll call that inclusion because the kid's physically present in a regular class, and that's not enough. We placed Jason in a regular class part of the time. We assigned a full-time aide. We even did therapy in the back of the classroom. He still can't do the same work as other kids. The inclusion isn't right for everyone. you still don't get it. Inclusive education, doing it wrong doesn't make it wrong. One of the things that was really interesting, we went to a school district, I won't name the state, even though it might be a place where George Bush is from. We went to this state, and the school was very excited for us to see their inclusion work. And they took us to a classroom, and on the classroom door was a sign, and the sign said, "Inclusion Room." And so we inquired about what this was. And turns out it was a special class for kids with disabilities who, for 20 minutes a day, left and went into a regular class with a paraprofessional. And that was their inclusion room. So one of the things you want to do is open the door on special class euphemisms. And they're called different things, more subtle. In Vermont, we see things more like, the discovery room or the learning center. But there are still euphemisms for special class. So we're going to talk about these characteristics, and I would ask you to just kind of, however you want to do it, rate yourself 1 to 10 or your school 1 to 10 or whatever about these characteristics and the extent to which they occur at your school. So the first characteristic of good inclusive education is that all students are welcomed. Here's inclusion mishap number 9. Due to a faulty intercom, Mrs. Snippet thought the principal said, "You have a new student coming to your classroom. Do your best to elude him." So are all the kids welcomed? Not just some of the kids, not just the kids with mild disabilities, but all of the kids. The principal saying to these two parents, "So I can earn 20,000 points for each student with a disability I include in regular class?" "That's right, redeemable for items in our catalog." Desperate parents resort to establishing their own frequent includer program. The second characteristic, and Phil touched on this morning, is the concept of natural proportion in terms of the numbers of students with and without disabilities. Mrs. Smith, I realize that on the surface it doesn't seem to make any sense to place your son who has behavior challenges in a class with 6 other aggressive antisocial boys, but trust me, I'm a qualified professional. This is my business. Mr. Moody tries a new technique after getting lost at a national education conference and spending a week at a used car sales seminar. I mean, think about it. What we do is, we put the kids in the most challenging environments to be successful by grouping them homogeneously. Same age options. This is based on some myths around inclusive education. Same age options are available to students with and without disabilities. See the big kid in the back of the room? This is placement problem number 32, functioning level rather than chronological age. So you see this all the time. People say, well, inclusion works really well at the young grades. Preschool, no problem. Early grades, no problem. But, once they start to get into upper elementary and middle school, the gap's too big, okay? And this is based on some faulty thinking. The faulty thinking being that the student must function at the same level as everyone else in order to be successfully included and have their needs met. And then they basically, so they keep the kid in kindergarten for 2 years and they keep him in, first grade and second grade. And so by the time the kid's in 3rd grade, he's like 16 years old. He's got a 5 o'clock shadow and then they say, we can't tolerate that. He doesn't fit. He's too big. So it's not about matching to functional level. Number 4 is that you've got individually appropriate learning outcomes with necessary supports offered within shared experiences. So that's a mouthful. It's got 3 parts. Let's just look at the cartoon for a second, then we'll go back and revisit those 3 parts. So the one teacher saying to the other, "It's amazing how well you've adjusted your teaching now that students with severe disabilities are in your class." Well, I just keep reminding myself, my students were each different before inclusive education. That hasn't changed, just expanded. Mrs. King sports her worn softball cap as a reminder that individualizing to meet unique student needs is old hat to good teachers. Good regular education teachers can teach kids with disabilities because the principles of motivation, the principles of teaching and learning, principles of assessment, data collection, and so on, none of those things change because a child has a disability label. They're the same things. They have to be stretched. They might have to be individualized, but the basic underlying principles are the same. A lot of you probably are familiar with the concept of disability as a social construction. the idea that disability is what we define it to be. You know, I was shocked when Mary Beth and I started doing some work in Europe to learn that in many European countries, they only identify anywhere between 2 and 5% of their kids as having disabilities. We have 13%. Like, what's wrong with, you know, the US of A? You know, how come we have so many more? Well, we don't have more kids with disabilities. Our kids aren't different than their kids. They just define disability differently. For those of you who were around in the 1970s, probably not too many of you, few of you, might remember that, you know, we have an organization that today is called the American Association on Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities, formerly American Association on Mental Retardation, and back in the 70s it was the American Association on Mental Deficiency. Okay, so they've kind of changed their name over time. But I don't remember what year it was, but I believe it was in the early 70s when there was a definitional change for borderline, what used to be called mental retardation, now more commonly referred to as intellectual disability. And so, I mean, what happened is they moved the line. And one day there were a whole bunch of people who, by definition, were at that time mentally retarded, borderline mentally retarded. They changed the definition. The next day, guess what? They're not retarded anymore. It was magic. They just changed the definition, you know? So, you know, would we teach those kids different on this day as opposed to the next day? No. The kids are the same. It's just how we look at it. This cartoon is based on this bird that kept, it was actually, I think it was a robin, actually. This bird's yellow, but this is examples from nature remind us that placement really does matter. Because people talk about how, you know, we can do great things in special classes, and they tell you about all the great things. And I would like to think that when I was a special class teacher, I'd like to think that I did some good things. But at the same time, placement really does matter. And this bird, if I left my car parked in the springtime for the weekend and didn't drive it, she would build a nest on my tire. And usually I would catch it before it was fully formed, and there'd just be some grass on there, and I'd wonder, what's this grass? And I'd pull it off, and then the next weekend, there'd be like a whole nest there. And it was a beautiful nest. I mean, perfectly constructed, A+ in nest building, okay? But it's not a very good place for a nest, okay? And so just because it's a good thing, if it's a good thing and it's in the wrong place, it's not working for you. And that's what's happening for a lot of our kids who are in special schools and special class. There may be some positive things that people are doing, and obviously there's a lot of caring people in those environments, but that placement really does matter. So inclusive settings are those that are frequented by people without disability. So this means not reverse mainstreaming. Okay, not the, you know, we've got a special class and twice a week for an hour, 3 kids who aren't disabled come into the special class. That's not inclusion. But that's one of those mislabeled examples. Placement of a child in a general education classroom is not enough to be included. It's just a foot in the door. Inclusive educational experiences are designed to enhance what, from some of our research, we call valued life outcomes. These valued life outcomes were identified by interviewing families who had children with quite severe and multiple disabilities. And we basically asked them a very simple question. We said, please tell us what it is that either does or would make your child's life a good life. And you know what? They said the same things that parents who have non-disabled children say. They say, we want our kid to be safe and healthy. We want our kid to have meaningful relationships with other people. We want them to be able to do interesting things in interesting places. We want them to have a home to live in now and in the future. These aren't different things than parents want for their children without disabilities. It's just that the likelihood of achieving them is a lot more difficult. So valued life outcomes seeking to make every link strong. So we want to make sure that the curriculum in inclusive schools is linked to valued life outcomes. There's an old Ray Charles song, and part of one of the lyrics is, none of us are free if one of us is chained. And these are some of the things that chain people with disabilities, and it's a lot easier to metaphorically represent this, you know, visually with with a wheelchair, but this could be a person with autism just as easily around inadequate support, segregated schooling, disability labeling, inadequate transportation, segregated housing, stigma, discrimination. These are the things that work in our society that hold back people with disabilities. And as long as they're held back, we're all held back. Inclusive education seeks a balance of academic, functional, and social personal aspects of schooling. It's a balancing act. It goes back to something I mentioned early on, which is that it's not an either or proposition. It's not, I hear some people saying, and this was true more 10 years ago, when people would say, well, inclusive education is about friendship. It's about, social interaction. It's not about kids really like learning academics. And then other people would say, well, no, it's about, meeting standards. It's about academics. And I don't think you can have one without the other. So the best inclusive schooling examples I've seen have been a real balance between these things. Inclusive education exists when the characteristics that I just mentioned occur on an ongoing daily basis. So a parent's calling the school and she says, we've just moved to the area and we have a daughter with a disability. Do you have inclusive education at your school? Yeah, every Tuesday and Thursday from 9 to 11. Principal Jones fails to recognize the contradiction in terms. So, you can't be a little bit included. You're either included or you're not included. Let's talk about some of the alternatives to inclusive education, because these are some of the reasons to say, you can't stay still, and it goes back to that matter of urgency, because I think that the alternatives to inclusive education are not pretty. So these are the reptilian responses to diversity, with disability just being one form of diversity. Let's attack it, let's eat it, let's run away from it. And that's kind of the primal, kind of limbic brain approach to dealing with things that are different. And that's what we have to overcome. What are you in for? Cerebral palsy, but they said with good behavior I could be out in 3 to 5. This is the parole approach to school inclusion. And I have to attribute this to Robbie Holland. Many of you know the well-known court case regarding his daughter, Rachel Holland, that helped us move inclusive education further. And he had written about this, and I asked him whether I could have his permission to make a cartoon out of it. But again, a lot of these are presented with physical disabilities just because they're easier visually. But again, this could be true for someone with autism or any type of disability. I mean, what do? We take kids and we put them into a segregated environment with all kids who are just like them, who have the same challenges that they have, which represents a very abnormal environment. And what we say basically is, okay, we're going to put you in the most abnormal environment we could possibly imagine. And what we want you to do is act as normal as possible in the abnormal environment. And if you can successfully be normal in the abnormal environment, you might be able to earn your way out of the abnormal environment into the normal environment. Right? And we're doing this because we're trying to help you. This is good. This is a good idea. So, I mean, it's pretty illogical, but that's what our system is based on right now. And I want to tell you a little story from when I was a special ed administrator in central New York. We eventually, when I took the job, there were 110 kids with moderate to severe disabilities, including some kids with real severe autism who were in a segregated wing of a vocational center in central New York. And my job was to try to get those kids out of there. And we had a 5-year plan to get all the kids into regular school. We got them all in regular school within 2 years. And some of them were still, this is in the early and mid 1980s, and they were when no kids with moderate and severe disabilities in New York State were in regular schools. They were all in what in New York are the BOCES, the Board of Cooperative Educational Services. They were all in segregated programs. And there was this one teenager, Billy, who had very severe autism. He had no language. He obviously had communication, but no language system at the time. And he engaged in some very severe behaviors in terms of self-destructive behaviors, as well as self-stimulatory behaviors, as well as behaviors that were very unpleasant for the staff, like feces smearing. Very, very intensive behaviors. And this vocational school, they also taught English and history on the campus because the kids who were in the vocational program, because of transportation issues, it was hard for them to get back and forth to their local schools to get the courses that they needed, and of course English and history being required. So one day, Billy took off, and people couldn't find him. And this is before the time when everybody had phones in their classrooms and stuff like that. And so people really panicked, and they're looking all over. Everybody's looking for Billy. Finally, I find Billy. He's sitting in a regular education English classroom. If you were to walk in that classroom, you could not have picked him out. Now, this is a kid who, if you had seen him when he was in the special classroom, he would have been rocking real big. He would have been, the hands would have been going. He would have been hitting himself. And he would have really been in full-blown self-stim mode, okay? And that was at a super high frequency. Walked in this classroom, there were no behaviors, okay? Now, unfortunately, nobody really acted on that, but I got to tell you, people were saying, wonder, like to know what was going on inside his head. What was he thinking? And then people started wondering, what was he taking in? And it gets to a concept that Ann Donnellan brought to the forefront in the early 1980s, the concept of the least dangerous assumption. Making the least dangerous assumption, or more frequently, some folks are calling it around presuming competence. Approaching people in the absence of having data to know for sure, the least dangerous thing you can do is to presume competence, to treat someone as if they are competent. You just wonder. And I had a close encounter with guilt when I met my student, Chris, who I mentioned was in my graduate class last semester. Because I said to him later in the semester that when I was a special class teacher, I had 3 students with autism in my class. I had 12 kids in my class one year, and 3 of them had autism. And one of the kids that I had presented almost identically to this young man, Chris, who is now in my graduate class, and who was typing out some pretty amazing stuff. And because of the time it takes him to type, he only takes typically 1 class a semester, sometimes 2, because it does take longer for him to communicate. But he did very well in class and offered a lot to our class. And I said to him, I just wonder, this boy Brian, who was my student, everybody presumed that he had severe intellectual disability. And he might have, but he might not have too. But we certainly treated him like he had, back in 1978, we certainly treated him like he had profound intellectual disability. And that was just wrong. We didn't really know it was wrong at the time, but in retrospect, it was wrong. And if people had treated Chris that way, my student, my recent student, he wouldn't be on his way to, getting his bachelor's degree right now, which he is successfully doing. So we want to avoid this parole approach because it really doesn't make sense. And then there's the idea of, the continuum. And a lot of people in a more contemporary way of thinking are advocating for a continuum of support rather than a continuum of placement. Okay, a continuum of support. Control, we're T-minus 48 minutes and counting for blast off to the space station. Extending the continuum, where will it end? Students who misbehaved in a special ed school are transferred to a more restrictive placement. So, because think about it, what do? A kid has a problem in regular class, we send him to the resource room. They have a problem in the resource room, we send him to special class. They have trouble with special class, they go to special school. What happens to the kids in special school? Where does it end? So, where it usually ends is, institutionalization or something horrendous. Fred can't stay in regular class because he disrupts student learning. So we've decided to recommend placement in a special class. So is that designed to solve the problem or just move it? Double standard number 5. If it's not okay to disrupt the education of students without disabilities, why is it okay to disrupt the education of students with disabilities? One of my very favorite students of all time was this young kid, Carl, who also had autism. And every once in a while I still get a Christmas card from Carl's mother. Carl's now almost 40. But I had him when he was 9 years old. And Carl had severe head banging. He had just a constant lump on his forehead from banging his head. He put his head through, they couldn't keep drywall up in his bedroom. You know, he was always putting his head through the walls. He put his head through bus windows. He'd knock over file cabinets, you know, and he was a very lovable kid, but he would really go off in this way. And there were a lot of kids in my class that had other types of disabilities that were completely defenseless. Kids with severe physical disabilities who in no way, shape, or form could protect themselves. And one of the things that the staff always had to guard against is that he would run up to kids and he'd grab somebody by the shoulders and he would bang them, you know? And so, again, it doesn't make sense to put him in an environment where that's the case. What's really interesting is, you know, there was almost this disconnect, and you all work with kids with autism a lot more than I do, but one of the kind of really endearing things that Carl used to do that always reminds me of my mother is that my mom, who passed away a few years ago, she always used to say, you know, like that you would never go to sleep mad at somebody that you love and that kind of thing. Well, when Carl would come out of these severe headbanging incidents, he was extremely remorseful, and he wanted to make up. And the way that he made up with his mother at home was to kiss her on the lips. And, you know, when you're 4, 5, 6 years old, you know, that's fine. You know, giving a little one a kiss on the lips like that, mom, you know, like that. Well, he wanted to kiss me on the lips, you know, and everybody in the plane wanted to kiss him on the lips. Like, okay, Carl, we don't have to kiss. And it's like, no, you're going to get a kiss, you know. And if you try to tell him, you know, no, it's okay, and then finally, you know, you were going to get this kiss whether you want it or not. So he'd kiss his thumb, and he'd come after you, you know. And as soon as that thumb, gone, everything was gone, you know. So, you know, we want to make sure that we're putting kids in the right places. Another thing we want to avoid is due process. Okay, teams, let's review the rules. Due process, that's the game where everybody gets a turn, nobody has fun, and even if you win, you feel like you've lost. By the time you go to due process, it's over. You know, it's over. So you want to do everything you can to avoid that. Mr. Krusty welcomes Fred to the Lobsterville Special Education Center, where their motto is, you can get in, but you can't get out. The reality is, and the reason I put this up here is, if a decision is made to move a kid to a special school, that is a life-altering decision because the odds are that kid's never coming out, okay? Even going to special class, moving from regular class to special class, the odds are they're not coming back. So once that decision gets made, it's a super serious decision and one we want to avoid at all costs. Here's my plan to include James in regular class. It's based on a NASA model. It doesn't have to be so complicated. Frank learns that inclusive education doesn't have to be rocket science. And, you know, on the side here, this is a kind of a paraphrasing. People who know me know that I'm from Buffalo, New York originally. And so that means that when you're born in Buffalo, you're kind of indoctrinated to be a Bills fan, which is a very long-suffering task. And our Hall of Fame coach, Marv Levy, when he talked about winning, he said that winning is simple, but it's not easy. And I think that that's what inclusive education is, or education in general. It's simple, but it's not easy. It's a lot of hard work. So it doesn't have to be rocket science, and in fact, it's not. I'm talking to you a little bit about the 6 big traps. And these are quasi-inclusion. Don't take the bait for these. One of the first ones, most common, is the attitude of hosting. And I showed the slide earlier where the teacher showed it in the first session. So I don't feel prepared to teach a child with disabilities. Despite having a master's degree and 18 years of experience, Mrs. Snippet tries to convince Mr. Moody that the student with disabilities in her class would be better served by an assistant with no experience. And this really speaks to the fears that regular ed teachers have about expectations. What's expected, what are they going to do, and so on. But the attitude of being the host just doesn't work. Another big trap is quasi-teamwork. Look over there, a well-functioning team. Isn't it beautiful? Herb and Sally add the elusive collaborative team to their life list of rare and endangered species. If you go into most schools and you ask people, do you use a collaborative team approach to serve your kids with disabilities? Everybody will tell you that they use a collaborative team approach. And the reality is that there's a lot of trappings of teamwork. There's groups of people, they meet together, they have an agenda, they keep minutes, they follow certain protocols, they have a lot of the trappings of inclusion, but they violate some of the most underlying characteristics of what differentiates a group from a team. And probably the single biggest thing that differentiates a team from a group is having shared goals. And lots of times we don't have that. Our agenda for today's meeting is to review the agenda from our last meeting, discuss why we don't get much accomplished at meetings, and set a date for our next meeting. This is Meeting Mania. We found that one of the simplest and best ways for regular ed teachers and special ed teachers to collaborate is to have the special educator move their desk into the regular classroom. So when they come in the morning, they go into the classroom. And they're right there with the 3 or 4 teachers that they're working with. Because you've all been at these meetings, way too many meetings. Not sure this is working for me. Fred expresses concern after team members all agree to pull in different directions. This is, Phil was talking this morning about transdisciplinary approaches, which is also an area that's of great interest to me. And one of the things that people do is everybody defers to one another. So everybody will tell you that they are child-centered, but the truth is that most people are discipline-centered. They do things that are valued by their discipline, regardless of what the child's needs are. And so what happens is at the IEP meeting, rather than having student goals, we have OT goals, we have PT goals, we have speech goals. And so if I'm a physical therapist and I say, I've done an assessment on this child, and based on my assessment, I think that these should be the 3 physical therapy goals. Well, nobody else around the table is a physical therapist, so we all say, hey, look, I'm not a physical therapist. Who am I to say what the physical therapy goals should be? Sure, I will defer to you. They don't use that language, but that's the message. I will defer to you, and now I'm the occupational therapist, and everybody defers to me, and we all defer to one another, and then we end up doing this, okay, pulling the kid in all different directions. If you look at the language in IDEA around related services are services that are required to assist the child, or that are required to assist the child to benefit from special education. They're required to help them benefit from special education or education. So you can't know what services a child needs until you know what the educational program is. They're there to support the education. One of the ways I like to think about it is that kids don't go to school to get therapy. They get therapy so that they can go to school. The goal isn't getting the therapy. The goal is getting an education, and the therapy is a way to help them get that education. You've always got people, when I talk to people about this in schools that are doing this, sometimes they get a little defensive, and they always wave stapled papers at me. And they say, can't you see that, this is all together. It's a team IEP. And what they do is they take the separate OT section, PT section, speech section, special ed section, and they staple it together. And they think because they put a staple on it, it's now voila, it's magically a team IEP. So transform your separate, disjointed, discipline-specific, uncoordinated goals into a team IEP. All you need is a magic stapler, $12.99. Includes fairy dust. Mary Beth showed you this cartoon earlier. She didn't think I was watching, but she showed you the black and white version. Attempts at airlifting special class approaches into regular class are unsuccessful. They just don't fit. I'm not saying throw out the baby with the bathwater. There's a lot of things we've learned in special education that we can apply in regular education. So I'm not saying that we don't need specialized instructional methods. I think we do. The research has shown that over and over. The thing is, we need to do that in a way that fits the context of regular education. We cannot ignore the context of regular ed. We have to go from their contextual starting point and fit our stuff into that, rather than saying to them, look, we're bringing a kid with a disability. We want you to turn your regular education system completely upside down and, do exactly what we do. Because they will hate your guts for that if they do that. And we tried that, and it just hasn't worked very well. Ineffective use of education assistance. Here's the deal. We've got lots of kids, too many who need extra help, too much paperwork, not enough planning time, extensive staff development needs. Thank goodness you're here. Our problems are solved. I'll do what I can, but I can only do so much. This is the Band-Aid approach. Are we expecting too much from instructional assistants? I think we are, and we talked about this morning in one of the breakout sessions. Ineffective use of support services. As I mentioned before, students don't go to school to get therapy. They get therapies in school if they're needed to receive an appropriate education. If we remodel bathrooms the way we deliver support services using a specialist-reliant model, this is what it would look like. People tripping over each other. Ineffective use of IEPs and evaluation of impact, too limited in scope. So, the song. You want to sing it with me? We got singers here. Get your motor running, head out on the highway, looking for adventure, and whatever comes our way. And it's born to be filed. Instead of born to be wild, it's born to be filed. And you got these two folders talking to each other, and the one folder says, no one's ever going to see us again, are they? Nope. Teammates engage in their annual post-IEP completion ritual. People write the IEPs because they have to. Now, I love IEPs when they're done well. I think that they're a great tool when they're done well. Unfortunately, they're not done well that often. And people write the IEP, they put it away, and then progress reporting comes around, and they say, what were we going to work on? So these are schools that are in programs that are not taking data every day. Because if they were taking data every day, they'd know what their goals were. But people can't tell you what their goals are. Because they wrote the goals on the IEP because they had to, and they used some computerized program where they've got like 78 annual goals and 147 short-term objectives, and it's completely unbelievable that they're going to do those things. But, it's a nice document, and it's very hefty. Congratulations, Larry. Again this year, you've achieved all your IEP goals. Thank you. And then he goes out into the real world. I'm sorry, you're not prepared for a real job. How can that be? I've achieved all my IEP goals. Larry learns the hard way that school and the real world don't always see success the same way. So what works? All for one and one for all. The three musketeers of good practice: values, logic or logical practices, and research, in that order. Regular ed teacher involvement and engagement, I touched on a little bit earlier. I think it's maybe the single biggest thing is that the regular ed teacher has to own that kid. They got to feel like that kid is their kid, that they are the teacher of that kid. And that's so important. Changing attitudes and expectations. My friend Dan Wilkins runs a little company that you may have seen at some conferences called The Nth Degree, and he's got some great T-shirts, and these are a few of his T-shirts. Your attitude might be my biggest barrier. I am, therefore I matter. Nothing about me without me, which is a common refrain in the self-advocacy community. So Peter ponders over apparel to wear to his next IEP meeting. We're looking at supportive models of service delivery that can absorb fluctuations, routine fluctuations that happen in schools. And given our time, I'm going to not get into this, but other than to say that we've got big caseload issues. I know in California you have class size issues. And so one of the things that we need to do is make sure that we're using or leveraging the work that we're trying to do for students with disabilities to also help kids without disabilities in terms of we need to say, hey, the class sizes are too big. 40's too many in a class. It's as simple as that. People say, oh, we can't do inclusion because, we've got too many kids in the classroom. Well, that's one way to look at it. Another way to look at it is you've got 40 potential helpers, but 40 is a lot. So, it's an issue that needs to be dealt with. This is some new research that we're just working on. And just each data point here represents a school, but we're really encouraged by these findings. I'll try to describe them as simply as I can. The horizontal axis shows ratio of special educator FTE to total school population, okay? And we're referring to that as the density. So, for example, on the far left, where it says 1 to 40, that's one special educator for every 40 kids in the school. At the far right, one special educator to every 160 kids in the school. And what we did was we got those data, and we also, as part of another data collection effort, asked special educators to rate their ability to do their work. I can't give you the exact language, but not surprisingly, when the ratio of special educators to total school population was high, when there was, say, 120 to 160 kids for every special educators were at the end of their rope. They were saying on a scale of 1 to 10, they rate their ability to do their work like 2 or 3. Schools that had low ratios, 1 to 40, 1 to 50, 1 to 80, they were much higher. And so we think this is a very simple metric that can be used to help give schools a sense of the health of their service delivery system. And it's something you can figure out quite easily with a couple quick calculations in your own school. Teamwork and family involvement. I'm going to scoot ahead because I really want to talk to you a little bit about that relates to this relevant curriculum and instruction about multi-level curriculum and curriculum overlapping. You notice this is the same stuff going in two directions. In the middle, you've got same curriculum, same content, level, and amount. When people talk about differentiated instruction, which is again, such a huge buzzword over the last several years, if you look at the literature on that, most of that is happening right here in the middle. It's just happening here, okay? It's not happening when kids have different learning outcomes. And so multi-level curriculum that's below grade level is happening when kids are in, I've got a definition I'll show you. We're going to look at multi-level same content, multi-level different content, and then curriculum overlapping. And these things are further and further away from the norm. So multi-level curriculum and instruction is when you've got a diverse group of students, could be a large or small group. Here's a key. It's a shared activity. Not a separate activity with the para in the back of the room, but a shared activity. Each learner has individually appropriate learning outcomes at an appropriate level of difficulty, and all the learning outcomes are within the same curriculum area, like science. So here's a social studies example. You can have a variation where you've got same subject matter. This refers to the topical subject matter being the same. So students are studying World War II, and students are learning major events and historical figures. Others explain political, social, economic factors affecting the war. So they're at different levels. They're all studying social studies. They're all studying World War II, but they have different learning outcomes. You can also have a step further removed where it's the same subject, but it's different content, different topic. So in math, most of the students are learning fraction, but another student is learning geometric shapes. They could be doing that within the context of a game or some other class activity. So it's still math, it's still the same curriculum area, which makes it still multi-level, but it's different content. And curriculum overlapping has the same first three criteria, but the fourth criteria is different. And that is that the learning outcomes come from two or more curriculum areas, like science and communication, math and social skills. So an example is the students pursuing communication or social goals, description, following instructions, taking turns within a science lab where most students are assembling a model of the human heart. Now, that student is involved in the activity of like in a lab group with two other kids, putting together that model of the human heart, but they may not have science learning outcomes. They might get science, but that isn't where they're starting based on the assessment data that they have. So this is another way to think about curriculum and instruction beyond the typical differentiated instruction. Effective use of paras. Great paras used wisely are worth their weight in gold. Effective utilization of specialized and natural supports. Everything for kids that have special needs doesn't have to be special, okay? Sometimes the most special thing you can do is make things regular. When Goldilocks went to school, they gave her support services. The first set was too small and it didn't fit. The next set was too big and it didn't fit. The next set was just right and it fit. Support services that are only as special as necessary fit just right. And that's where we have to take data. So because we make a guess, it's always a guess. Hopefully it's an informed guess, but then we take data to see whether it works, and then we make adjustments. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit here. Effective IEPs and relevant evaluation of impact. I lost inches and pounds off my IEPs using Slim Plan. You can too. Before, my IEPs were bloated, thick, and weak. I had unwanted inches and unsightly goals and objectives. After, now my IEPs are slim, lean, and strong. I feel better and I have more energy. Helen helps herself have healthier habits. Promoting self-determination is another important aspect of inclusive education. You must be a very special person to work with disabled children. Well, actually, hello, I'm right here. I can hear you. I have a name. Hey, lady, didn't your mother ever teach you it's rude to talk about people in front of them? Judy's brand of in-your-face self-advocacy first showed itself at an early age. And I'm going to end with a couple slides and a very, very short video that's about less than a minute long, but here's Fern following some fierce figuring and formulating. Fern finally finds the common denominator of quality education. And that common denominator is that kids' lives will be better because they went to our school. And that's really the bottom line. And I know Mary Beth already shared this cartoon with you, but I'm going to share it again because I think it's such an important message. And that is that clearing a path for people with special needs clears a path for everyone. So I'm going to end by just showing you a very, very short video. Why did it do that? Of Ben. And Ben graduated from high school in Vermont. I realize it's a little messy up here, but I think Ben's language speaks for itself, so I'll just play this.
Future instructional needs.
Personally, I learned so much just about life from being involved in regular education, and I think it's pretty safe to say I've taught my peers a thing or two about what it's like to live under unique circumstances.
I can't think of a more eloquent way to say it than the way that he said it. Living under unique circumstances. You know, I'm looking forward maybe to a day, I hope it's not too far into the future, but I suspect it may be, where we don't talk about people as having disabilities and being deficient. We recognize that everybody's different, everybody's got